He seemed to be in every direction she turned. The man named Andrew Yong, New York's most eligible bachelor, her stepmother and stepsister's golden ticket to the life they'd always wanted. But here he just was, in every inch of her space. The plan had been simple: foster civility, keep her distance, and disappear back into the background where she'd always belonged. But what could she do when he looked at her with eyes that didn't blink past her like everyone else? A smile that undid her composure one slow degree at a time? Words that made her feel seen, not as simply the older invisible stepsister, not as the family's reliable fixer, but as someone worth leaning into. Her heart hadn't pounded like this in years. And she was no closer in finding a way out, a solution, a pause button, than she was in losing it completely altogether. Which then brings us to a story about a woman in golden brown. About a man who moved halfway across the city just to be closer to her. About family that takes, and what happens when you finally stop letting them. The kitchen smelled like cardamom and browned butter, and Naomi Briggs was exactly where she needed to be. She moved through the back of the venue with the quiet authority of someone who had long stopped needing to raise her voice to be heard. Her team knew their stations. The appetizer trays were going out on schedule, the entree timing was precise, and the client, a hedge fund partner celebrating his firm's 15th year, was somewhere out front, blissfully unaware of how much controlled chaos had preceded his perfectly plated evening. Table 6 needs a vegetarian swap, her sous chef, Marcus, said as she passed. Already handled. I prepped 2 extras. She lifted the corner of a cloth napkin, inspected the garnish beneath, and set it back down. And tell Dara to stop rushing the sauce. It's not a race. Marcus nodded and disappeared. Naomi allowed herself one still moment, just one, with her eyes closed, breathing in the smell of a kitchen that was working exactly as it should. Her mother had taught her that a good kitchen had a sound to it, a rhythm, and that if you listened closely enough you could tell when something was about to go wrong before it did. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She already knew who it was before she looked. Gloria. She stepped to the side of the kitchen, away from the noise, and answered. I'll be there by 7, she said, before her stepmother could open with whatever she had prepared. A pause. Then Gloria's voice, smooth and slightly wounded, as it always was. I just wanted to make sure you hadn't forgotten. I hadn't forgotten. She hung up. Marcus was watching her from across the kitchen with the particular expression he reserved for these calls, not quite pity, not quite worry. Something in between. Naomi tucked the phone away and reached for a clean spoon. The sauce, she reminded him. He went. She stayed. The house in Forest Hills looked the same as it always did from the outside, well kept, warmly lit, the kind of home that gave a good impression to people who didn't know what happened inside it. Naomi let herself in with her key. The living room was already full. Her stepmother, Gloria, was dressed in a deep plum wrap dress that Naomi suspected was new. Her stepsister, Monique, sat beside her with the restless energy of someone waiting for something to begin, her nails freshly done. Several relatives were arranged across the sofas, aunts, a cousin or 2, her father's older brother, who nodded at Naomi when she entered but did not stand. The only person who stood was Uncle Kwon. He was a large man, warm in the way that very few large men managed to be, and he crossed the room to meet her with his arms already open. She let him hug her and felt, as she always did around him, the faint ache of something that used to be whole. Naomi. He held her by the shoulders and looked at her the way her father used to, like she was still worth examining closely. You look well. Are you eating? I run a catering company, Uncle Kwon. He laughed, a full, room-filling sound, and steered her toward the table. Come. Sit. We were just talking about Andrew. Dinner was already laid out. Naomi took the empty seat beside her uncle and reached for the serving spoon, because no one else seemed to be moving. Uncle Kwon launched back into whatever story he had been telling. Andrew, his nephew, had just returned from 2 years in Korea. The details came in enthusiastic waves: a major acquisition, a landmark partnership with one of Seoul's largest conglomerates, a profile in a financial publication that Uncle Kwon had apparently framed. The table listened with varying degrees of interest. Gloria listened with the kind of focused attention she gave to information she might find useful later. There's a ceremony next Friday, Uncle Kwon said, reaching for his glass. A proper celebration. I want all of you there. He looked around the table, unhurried and certain, and his gaze landed on Naomi last, with intention. All of you. Gloria set down her fork with a small, considered sound. Naomi is so busy these days, she said. I'm sure she has events booked. We wouldn't want her to have to cancel anything on our account. She let a small pause settle before adding, lightly, besides, Naomi is past their age. Across the table, one of the aunts made a soft sound of agreement. True. Monique should go. She's at the right age for these things. Her eyes moved briefly to Naomi, 35 and still running around with trays and spatulas. Your father would have wanted more for you by now, dear. Naomi did not look up from her plate. I'll move things around, she said, to Uncle Quan and no one else. He was already smiling, the same smile her father used to wear when she did something that made him proud without her realizing it. He reached over and patted her hand once, and went back to his story. Monique refilled her own glass and said nothing. Gloria's eyes lingered on Naomi a moment longer, thoughtful, before she turned back to Uncle Quan with a warm smile and asked him to tell them more about this nephew of his. The venue was everything the occasion asked for, floor-to-ceiling windows above Midtown, warm light, a crowd assembled in the specific way of people who had all dressed to be noticed. Naomi arrived in golden brown, a dress she had owned for 2 years and rarely worn, chosen tonight because it required no thought, and she had none left to give. She accepted a glass of wine from the nearest tray and positioned herself somewhere that was not in the middle of the room. Andrew Yong, she gathered quickly, was the one everyone was moving toward. Tall, composed, with an ease about him that most men in rooms like this performed rather than possessed. He moved through congratulations and handshakes and the particular orbit of women angling for his attention like a man who found it all genuinely amusing. He was not indifferent. He was simply not dazzled by any of it. He looked, if anything, like he was having a good time watching people try. Naomi watched this for approximately 90 seconds before deciding it was none of her business and looking away. She did not see Gloria take Monique by the arm and steer her, with precision, toward the man of the evening. She did not watch Andrew receive them with impeccable, entirely surface-level politeness, his eyes already moving past them both before the introductions had finished. She was reading the back of someone's name card. She finished her wine. The room had grown louder in the particular way that meant nothing new was going to happen, just more of the same noise at a higher volume. She looked toward the far end of the room and found what she was looking for, a set of glass doors, slightly ajar, opening onto a balcony. She went. She did not notice that someone watched her go. The air outside was cool and immediate, and Naomi let out a slow breath that she felt like she had been holding since she arrived. She heard the door behind her open. She turned, expecting a waiter, and found Andrew Yong instead, jacket still buttoned, a drink in hand, looking at her with the open curiosity of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. She straightened. Mr. Yong. A small, apologetic incline of her head. Congratulations. I should have said so earlier. You're saying it now. He came to stand at the railing, leaving a reasonable distance between them. Are you enjoying the evening? Naomi considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Then she decided honesty would probably end the conversation faster than courtesy would, and she wanted to finish her wine in peace. Not especially, she said. I find these things a bit suffocating. All the it's so wonderful to meet you and the it's been so long. After a while it starts to feel like everyone is reading from the same script. She paused. I'm sorry. That was probably not the right thing to say to the guest of honor. He tilted his head. Why not? You're describing my entire evening. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was watching her with something that had nothing to do with politeness, and she found that she did not know exactly what to do with it. I'm Naomi, she said. My father was a friend of your uncle's. Andrew. He leaned against the railing. And I know. He talked about your father often. A small silence settled between them, comfortable enough that neither of them felt the need to fill it immediately. Below, the city continued without them. Inside, the party continued without them too. They talked. About nothing of great consequence, and somehow about all of it. She learned that he disliked ceremonial things but loved the work that preceded them. He learned that she ran a catering business, and he asked about it with the kind of attention that meant he was actually listening. Time passed without either of them accounting for it. When she finally checked her watch, she was genuinely surprised. Naomi drove. This was simply how it went. She had the working license, and she was the most sober, and no one had ever thought to question or thank her for it. Gloria sat in the passenger seat. Monique sat behind her, ankles crossed, turning her phone over in her hands. "He barely looked at me," Monique said. "All night. I was right there." "There were a lot of people," Gloria said, in the even tone she used when she was managing rather than consoling. "These things take time. He's only just returned. There will be other opportunities." "It's embarrassing, Mama." "It isn't." Gloria's voice smoothed over into something warmer. "You were beautiful tonight, Monique. There's absolutely no way he'd be able to resist a woman as young and as pretty as you." The car was quiet for a moment after that. Naomi kept her eyes on the road. She thought, without meaning to, about the balcony. About the way he had leaned against the railing like he had no intention of going back inside. About how talkative he had been for a man supposedly exhausted by conversation, and how he had asked about her catering business as though the answer genuinely mattered to him. She thought about the way he had smiled when she said something dry, like it was the thing he had been waiting for all evening. She thought briefly that most of the people in that room had come wanting something from him, and that he had received all of it with such uncomplicated warmth, and that there was something a little sad about that even if he hadn't seemed to notice. She thought, with some detachment, that he was young. More youthful than her most certainly. Probably didn't have a grey hair or a tired morning to his name. Then she thought how none of this thinking was even her business. She signaled, turned, and moved on. It's not like they would ever meet again. Naomi heard the renovation sounds on a Tuesday. She had just gotten home from a site visit, shoes off before she cleared the entryway, and the noise filtered down through her ceiling in steady, purposeful intervals. Drilling. The drag of something heavy across a floor. The particular percussion of a space being remade. She stood in her kitchen for a moment and listened, then poured herself a glass of water and thought nothing more of it. Someone was finally moving into the penthouse above hers. Good. An empty floor had a sound to it too, and she had never liked it. The renovation stretched across several days. Then it stopped. On the evening it stopped, Naomi baked a batch of welcome cookies, brown butter chocolate chip, her mother's base recipe with her own adjustments, wrapped them in a cloth, and rode the elevator up one floor. She was not someone who made a habit of neighborhood socializing. But she had been raised to acknowledge people, and so she would acknowledge whoever this was, hand over the cookies, and return to her evening. She knocked. The door opened, and the person behind it was Andrew Yong. He was freshly showered. Sweatpants sitting low on his hips, a towel draped around his neck, his hair still damp. His chest and the broad span of his shoulders were bare, and Naomi's eyes went there for exactly 1 second before she brought them back up. He looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived, very quickly, at something that looked like satisfaction. She looked down at the cloth-wrapped cookies in her hands. "You're the one who bought the penthouse," she said. It was, she recognized immediately, a deeply unnecessary thing to say. He was standing in the doorway of the penthouse. Of course he had bought it. Andrew leaned against the doorframe, a slight grin already pulling at his mouth. He took the cookies from her. "Thank you for these," he said. She gave a slight smile in return. "It's nothing. Welcome to the building." Then she turned and walked back to the elevator. He watched her go, still grinning long after she had rounded the corner. It would be more accurate, though Andrew did not say this out loud, to say that he owned the entire building. He had known this, of course, from the moment his property manager had flagged the vacancy 1 floor above Unit 14B. What he had not known, not until he was standing in that doorway with a towel around his neck and a plate of cookies in his hands, watching her walk back down the hall with her spine perfectly straight, was that she would look exactly the same as she had on that balcony. Composed. Unreachable. And yet she had stood there a half-second too long before she turned to leave, and he had seen her eyes drop to his chest before she caught herself, and he was still thinking about it long after he closed the door. He had found her after the ceremony the same way he found most things he was serious about, thoroughly. Her catering business had a clean digital footprint. Her social media was split between high-end event coverage and a skincare and hygiene page she ran with the same no-nonsense directness she applied to everything else. And then there were the cooking videos, unhurried, warm, narrated in that voice that gave you the information and nothing extra. He had watched several of them at hours that did not reflect especially well on him. He had called his property manager shortly after. His stated reason to his family for leaving the Yong family home was proximity to the office. His best friend and business partner, Daniel Cho, had listened to this explanation over the phone and gone quiet for a moment, not because he believed it, not for a single second, and not when all Andrew had been doing for weeks was talking about the woman he'd met at the ceremony. Describing the way she had looked at him when he'd surprised her on that balcony. The way she'd answered his question about the party with complete, unguarded honesty, like she'd simply decided he could handle it. The way she had laughed exactly once, and how he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since. Daniel knew exactly what proximity to the office was, which was nothing but a cover-up. He waited a beat, purely for effect, and then laughed until Andrew hung up on him. A few mornings after moving in, Andrew was returning from an early errand when he spotted her through the lobby's glass doors. She was the only one standing at the ground floor elevator, waiting, her bag on her shoulder and her eyes on the display above the doors. The arrow was descending from the top floor, his floor, the only unit on it, and she was watching the numbers tick down with the focused patience of someone running through a mental list. Then she seemed to think of something. She turned, walked past the elevator entirely, and pushed through the door to the stairwell. The elevator arrived not long after, its doors sliding open to a small tide of residents filing out, and no Naomi stepping in. Andrew stood among them and watched the stairwell door settle shut. Then he shook his head slowly, the corner of his mouth pulling up despite himself, and stepped into the elevator. For her part, Naomi was already several flights up before she registered what she had just done. She had been standing at the elevator, perfectly fine, watching the display come down from his floor, and then something in her had simply redirected her feet toward the stairs without consulting her first. She lived on the 14th floor. The stairs were not a trivial decision at any point in the day, least of all in the morning. She could not explain it, which bothered her more than the stairs did. She was a woman who could account for her own choices. She did not do things without reasons. She reached a landing somewhere in the middle and paused to breathe. It was probably just that she had been in a hurry, she reasoned. The stairs were faster sometimes, when the elevator was slow, when there were other residents with other floors to stop at. She had simply felt like moving. It had nothing to do with anything or anyone in particular. She was 35 years old. She was not going to stand on a stairwell landing and pretend she didn't know her own mind. She was not avoiding him. That would imply there was something to avoid, which there wasn't, because there was nothing going on. She kept climbing. She went to the building's gym at 6 in the morning because that was when it was empty. It was not empty when she arrived. Andrew was in the corner with the free weights, working through a set with the steady, unhurried focus of someone who had been doing this long enough that it required no thought. His back was to her, the muscles across his shoulders and down the length of his back shifting with each controlled rep, his form clean and practiced. Naomi dropped her bag, pulled her hair back, and stepped onto the treadmill. She looked straight ahead. There was a mirror on the wall in front of her, which was a standard feature of most gyms, and if her gaze drifted toward his reflection in it while she found her pace, that was simply a function of where the mirror was positioned. She was not staring. She was warming up. These were two entirely different things. She told herself to stop staring. She was a 35-year-old woman, not a schoolgirl, and she had far better things to do with her attention than track a man across a gym mirror. So she relocated to the cable machine. She had planned to use it anyway. She had decided this before she arrived, and the fact that it was on the opposite end of the room from the free weights was a coincidence of layout and nothing more. She was 3 representatives into her second set when the weight stack began pulling unevenly and she realized the adjustment was wrong. She stopped, looked at the pin, looked at the cable, and was reaching up to fix it when she became aware of him standing just behind her. "Your grip," he said. Not a criticism. Just a fact. She adjusted her hands on the bar, and he leaned closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm, and repositioned the cable height with a single practiced motion before stepping back. "Try it now," he said. She did. The difference was immediate, and she finished the rest of her set without the drag. When she turned around, he was standing a few feet back, water bottle in hand, watching her with the patient attention of someone who had genuinely just wanted to help and hadn't thought much further than that. She found this, for reasons she couldn't immediately name, more disarming than if he had been self-congratulatory about it. "Thank you," she said. "Early riser," he observed. "Always." She reached for her water. "You." When I can be. Still adjusting since I got back. Career runs on different hours. How long were you there? 2 years. Felt like 4. He sat on the bench behind him, apparently not leaving. You grew up here? Queens. Mostly. She leaned against the machine. You. Manhattan. Seoul for university, then back. Then Seoul again. He tilted his head slightly. 3 years in this building? 3 years. Good building, he said, in a tone she chose not to examine too closely. They talked for 20 minutes, standing in a gym at 6 in the morning as though it were a perfectly reasonable place to have a conversation. It was easy in a way she hadn't prepared herself for, and when she finally picked up her bag to leave she noticed that she hadn't once thought about the stack of things waiting for her at the office. She thought about that in the elevator, briefly, and then filed it away under things that didn't require further examination. A few days after the gym, she made a double batch of lemon poppy seed muffins for a client tasting and had more left over than she knew what to do with. She boxed half of them up, rode the elevator up 1 floor, and knocked on his door. He answered in a grey Henley and socked feet, and she held out the box. I had extras from a tasting, she said. And I wanted to thank you properly for the other day at the gym. He looked at the box, and then at her. You didn't have to do that. I know. She offered a small shrug. Consider it building courtesy. He took the box from her and stepped back, opening the door a little wider. Come in, he said with a grin. I was just about to put the kettle on. She told herself 10 minutes. What happened next would later strike Naomi as one of the more bewildering things she had witnessed in recent memory, and she had catered events where genuinely extraordinary things went wrong. She was seated at his kitchen island when she heard him behind her, the click of a burner, the scrape of the kettle being set down, and then, not long after, a smell that had absolutely no business coming from a pot of water. She turned around. The kettle was sitting on the wrong burner entirely. The burner that was actually lit was heating an empty pan beside it, which had begun to smoke in the cheerful, indifferent way of something that had been left unattended and had long since made its peace with that. Andrew had his back to both of them, scrolling through something on his phone. Andrew. He looked up. The pan, she said. He turned, registered the smoke rising from the dry pan, and moved with the decisive efficiency of a man who was very competent in most areas of his life and had clearly decided that this particular one simply did not apply to him. He got the pan off the heat and relocated the kettle to the correct burner, and then he turned back to face her with an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral. She looked at him for a long moment. How, she said, carefully, does someone manage to burn an empty pan while trying to boil water? It's a complicated morning. It's not even 7 o'clock yet, she stated. He had nothing to add to that. And there it was, a flicker across his face, the specific discomfort of a man who was used to being good at things, confronting the one room in his life where that simply was not the case. Not quite embarrassment. Close enough to it. She thought about the framed profile. The Seoul conglomerate. The 2 years of work that had apparently reshaped an entire branch of the Yong business portfolio. She looked at the smoking pan. The unsung plights of a golden boy, she thought. And then smiled, warmly, without any edge to it. It's okay, she bid him closer. Come here. He came to stand beside her at the stove and she walked him through it from the beginning. The right burner. The correct amount of water. The simple, unglamorous patience of waiting for something to do what it was going to do without intervening. He listened with his full attention, arms folded, eyes tracking everything she indicated. He did not perform knowledge he didn't have, and he asked 2 questions that were entirely sincere, and she answered them the same way. When the kettle finally whistled, he looked quietly pleased with himself, in the particular way of someone who had accomplished something small and was going to remember it. She helped him wipe down the pan and put the kitchen back to rights afterward. They worked side by side without talking much, passing things back and forth in the easy way of people who had already figured out each other's rhythm without meaning to. She reached past him at one point to hang the cloth back on its hook, and in the half-second that her shoulder brushed his arm, he went still beside her. She didn't notice. She was already moving on to the next thing. He noticed. He stayed where he was for a moment after she stepped away, watching the side of her face while she tidied things on the counter, and something in his chest pulled with a force that arrived without warning. The urge to close the space between them, to draw her in and tuck his face against the curve of her neck and simply stay there. It moved through him fast and certain, and the stopping of it required considerably more effort than he would have liked to admit. His jaw tightened. His hands, hanging at his sides, closed slowly into fists, knuckles whitening, the veins in his forearms standing out with the effort of holding very still. He exhaled once, quietly, and went to pour the tea. From that evening on, whenever they both had time, usually late, after the rest of the day had finished with them, she would come upstairs and teach him something in his own kitchen. Simple things at first. The fundamentals. He was a dedicated student in the way that people who are genuinely curious about something always are, standing close, paying careful attention, and asking questions at the right moments. He had a habit of watching her hands when she demonstrated something, with the same focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him at work, and she found that she didn't mind being watched like that. Which was its own kind of information, and she chose not to sit with it for too long. He grinned every time he got something right without being corrected, like he was 12 years old and simply couldn't help it. She told herself this was not particularly endearing. She was not especially convincing, even to herself. He was not what she had assumed. She had expected a certain kind of man, polished, self-referential, the kind who wore his success like a second suit and filled silences with his own name. Instead, she found someone who spoke about the people on his team the way she spoke about her kitchen staff, with investment, and with real stakes. When something in their work went wrong, he got frustrated with the inefficiency, not the people, and he was specific about the difference. He had a silliness to him that surfaced in unguarded moments and caught her completely off guard every time, because nothing in his public profile had suggested it. He was chalant in a way that made her realize she had spent so long around people who were performing something, composure, authority, contentment, any number of things, that she had forgotten people like this existed. People who were simply, genuinely, themselves. He made her laugh. Not the managed kind she kept ready for clients and rooms full of people she didn't particularly want to be in. Real laughter, full and unguarded, rising before she could catch it. The first time it happened fully, she was so startled by the sound of her own voice that she pressed her hand over her mouth. He looked at her from across the island with an expression she didn't have an immediate name for, still and attentive, and something else that sat quietly underneath both of those, and then he smiled, slow and unhurried, like he had been hoping for exactly that and was glad it had finally come. She thought about that expression later, more than once, in her own apartment in the dark. He once spent several uninterrupted minutes telling her, in considerable and specific detail, what her peach cobbler had done to him personally, how the crust had broken, what the filling had smelled like, whether it was the brown sugar or the butter that had gotten to him most, and that he had genuinely considered sitting down on the kitchen floor about it. She had to turn toward the window to collect herself, pressing her lips together until she was sure her expression was under control, while he continued earnestly behind her, apparently unaware that he was being extremely difficult to deal with. The tension between them grew not from grand gestures but from small accumulated things. The way he would shift closer when they were both looking at something on her laptop together, close enough that she was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with the screen. An evening when they both reached for the same serving spoon at the same moment and his hand closed over hers, and neither of them moved away immediately, they just looked at each other for a beat too long, until she cleared her throat and handed it to him. The way he watched her sometimes in the middle of a sentence, not following her words but reading her face, and she would find somewhere else to look because she didn't yet know what to do with the particular quality of his attention. She was 35 years old. She had managed a business, managed a family that was never hers to raise, and held every moving piece of her own life together for longer than she cared to count. She did not fluster. Andrew Yong flustered her, and she found this genuinely inconvenient. She thought about it more than was reasonable, and she didn't do anything about either of these facts, filing the feeling under things that didn't warrant further investigation, like the extra portions she started timing to be ready when she heard his door, and the fact that she knew what his coffee order was without being told, and the particular way the evenings felt shorter now than they used to. She had to remind herself that he was younger, she didn't know by how much, but younger was younger, and she didn't need to add developing feelings for someone who probably saw her as nothing more than a passing curiosity to her already long list of problems. She agreed on that firmly, every time she arrived at it. She did not, however, like the way her chest tightened afterwards. They were at his place when it happened. She had brought food, he had opened wine, and dinner had extended itself the way it did now, past the eating, past the clearing of plates, into the kind of easy, unhurried conversation that had become familiar enough that she no longer had to remind herself it was getting late. The kitchen island had become their usual place. 2 stools, the warm overhead light, the city carrying on outside the window without being asked. He stepped away to take a call partway through. The moment he answered, his posture changed, shoulders squaring, voice dropping, one hand resting flat on the counter as he worked through whatever needed his attention. She watched him without deciding to. The set of his jaw when he was focused. The way he turned toward the window when the conversation required precision, and back when it didn't. The way he pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose when he was thinking something through and didn't realize he was doing it. He finished the call and turned back to find her watching him. Am I that handsome? The corner of his mouth was already lifting. You were staring pretty hard, Naomi. It was teasing, and the correct response was something dry that would keep everything where it had been. Instead, something in her settled, quietly, and without her permission, and she answered him honestly. Yes, she said. She turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. You really are. A small pause, and then the rest of it, because she had already started. And you work incredibly hard. Whoever ends up with you is going to be very lucky. The amusement left his face completely. He set his phone on the counter. He crossed the kitchen toward her, unhurried, with the quiet certainty of someone who had made up his mind, and his eyes stayed on hers the entire way, steady and intent, with an attention that made the room feel considerably smaller than it had been a moment ago. He stopped in front of her. His hand came up and cupped her cheek, warm and deliberate, his thumb resting just below her cheekbone. It would be me, he said, quietly. I would be the lucky one. He leaned in toward her, and she did not move away, her heart loud in her own chest. But just then, his phone rang on the counter behind him, and he stilled. He held the moment for one more second, weighing it, and then exhaled softly and reached back and answered it, because it was Daniel, and there was always the possibility it was something that couldn't wait. It was not something that couldn't wait. They wrapped up the evening not long after, both of them careful with each other in the specific way of people who have nearly crossed a threshold and aren't entirely sure what to do with the nearness of it. She said goodnight at the door. He said goodnight. She took the elevator down to her floor and stood in her own dark entryway for a moment before she moved. Andrew rode back up to his floor, took out his phone, and called Daniel back. Daniel had interrupted what would have been one of the best moments of his life, and so the things Andrew said to him that night, with great feeling and considerable specificity, were not the kind that could have passed in polite company, not by any measure. Naomi called Simone 3 days later. They had been friends since they were 19, the kind of friendship that didn't require upkeep, that could survive weeks of silence and pick up mid-sentence without any adjustment period. Simone ran a boutique in the West Village and had opinions about everything and softened none of them for anyone, which was one of the primary reasons Naomi had kept her around for nearly 2 decades. She told her about the almost kiss. She had intended to be brief. She was not brief. He said it would be him, she said, from the corner of her couch with her knees pulled to her chest. That he would be the lucky one. And he was just looking at me like. Like what? Simone said. Like I was worth looking at. Properly. A beat. Then, with feeling, Naomi. And his hand was on my face, Simone. He was already leaning in, and then Daniel called. The sound Simone made was vivid and deeply sympathetic, and then she laughed, and Naomi laughed, and for a few minutes they were 19 again, breathless and ridiculous. Simone pulling every detail out of her and Naomi giving them up with the embarrassed precision of someone who had replayed the moment far more times than she would ever say out loud. You deserve this, Simone said, once they had both settled. Her voice had come down from the laughter into something more careful, more deliberate. You hear me? After everything you carry. Everything you're still carrying right now. You deserve to feel exactly this stupid and happy over somebody. Naomi went quiet for a moment, turning her phone over in her free hand. I just keep thinking, she said, about everything around me. It's already so hectic. Relationships are. She drawled. What? Complicated? Naomi didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Well, welcome to the real world, Simone said, without missing a beat. Stop trying to talk yourself out of something good before it even starts. And from what I've heard, that man doesn't sound like a hot today, cold tomorrow type of person. He is interested in you. Naomi opened her mouth. She was going to say something honest. She could feel it forming. Her phone buzzed against her cheek. She pulled it away and looked at the screen. A debit alert. A number large enough that she read it twice, and then a third time, in case she had somehow misread it. She had not. Client funds. Set aside in trust for an upcoming event. Money that was not hers to absorb, not under any circumstances. The warmth drained from the room entirely. "Naomi," Simone said. "You still there? I have to go." Her voice came out even, which cost her something. "I'll call you back." She did not call back that night. The confrontation at the family house the next day was exactly as productive as Naomi had expected it to be, which was to say not at all. She had driven out to Forest Hills with a specific intention, to ask, calmly and directly, why a large sum of money, client funds she had been holding in trust for an upcoming event, had been withdrawn from her account without her knowledge or her permission. She had rehearsed the tone of it in the car. Level. Firm. Not accusatory, just clear. She hadn't made it past the living room before the relatives arrived, or rather, she arrived to find that they were already there, arranged across the sofas as though they had been expecting her and had dressed for the occasion. Gloria met her near the door with the expression of a woman who had been wronged and wanted everyone present to bear witness to it. Monique sat to the side with her arms crossed, performing a wounded silence that didn't quite land. "You want to talk about the money?" Gloria said, before Naomi had gotten 2 sentences out. "After everything I do for this family. After everything I have sacrificed." "The money wasn't mine to give," Naomi said, still level. "It belongs to a client. I am responsible for it." "You are responsible for this family," an aunt said from the sofa, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict that had already been decided. "That is what your father would have wanted." "Yes. What your father would have wanted," said another, nodding. Naomi stood there in the middle of the room and looked at all of them, at Gloria's performance of injury, at Monique's borrowed indignation, at the relatives who had never once asked how she was managing before pronouncing judgment on how she was doing it. She felt the specific, exhausting futility of a conversation that had already been decided before she walked in. She wanted to yell, to scream her lungs out at the people who had spent years invalidating her, dismissing her, and rewriting history from the comfort of sofas she had paid for. But she knew, just as she had known for the better part of 30 years, that it would all be in vain. She left the same way she came. Angry, frustrated, and alone. That evening, Andrew came to her door at the usual time, takeout in hand, with the easy confidence of someone who had not yet been informed that the evening was not going to go the way he expected. She opened the door, looked at him and the takeout, and said, "Not tonight." He blinked. "Everything okay?" "Fine. I'm just tired." "Good night, Andrew." She closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the space where she had been, and then went back upstairs. He was confused, but he didn't push. She had said she was tired. People were tired. The next evening he came back, still with takeout, because he was an optimist by nature and had decided that one closed door did not constitute a pattern. She opened it again, and this time she looked worse than tired. There were shadows under her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before, and she was still in her work clothes at 8 in the evening, which meant she hadn't stopped moving since morning. "I brought the dumplings you like," he said, holding up the bag by way of an argument. "I'm not hungry." "You're always hungry by 8. Andrew." Her voice was flat. "Please." He went. He was less certain this time, turning it over in his mind on the elevator ride up, trying to work out what he had done wrong. He replayed the almost kiss for the 100th time, wondering if the charge between them had become too much, if she had decided to pull back deliberately. The thought sat unpleasantly in his chest. The third evening he came back anyway, because apparently this was simply who he was. He had brought nothing this time, no food, no excuse, just himself, and when she opened the door he opened his mouth to ask if she wanted to talk, or to sit somewhere quietly, or to do nothing at all, whatever she needed. She cut him off before he got there. "Andrew, I said I'm fine, so please just..." And then something cracked in the middle of the sentence, something she had clearly been pressing down for several days, and what came out instead was sharp and exhausted and aimed directly at him. That she was tired of people showing up at her door, that she had enough to manage without adding to it, that she didn't need someone checking on her every single evening as if she couldn't handle being alone. The hallway went quiet. She heard it the moment it left her, the weight of it, and how badly it had missed the mark. She saw the look that crossed his face before he could school it away. Not anger. Something quieter than that, and harder to look at directly. "I'm sorry," she said, immediately. "That wasn't meant for you." "I know," he said. But he went home. She knocked on his door an hour later with a bottle of wine she'd had since Christmas and no particular plan beyond the apology she owed him. He let her in without making her work for it, which was somehow worse than if he had been difficult about it, and they settled on the sofa with 2 glasses and the particular quiet of people who have something to clear between them. "I'm sorry," she said again, properly this time. "You didn't deserve that." "No," he agreed, without heat. "I didn't. But something did." "So what happened?" She turned her wine glass in her hands the same way she always did when she was deciding how much to say, and then she looked at him and told him all of it. The account. The client funds. The confrontation that had accomplished nothing. The relatives arranged on the sofas like a panel. The way her stepmother had turned a question about money she had no right to take into a performance about Naomi's failures as a daughter, and the way everyone in that room had nodded along without question. She spoke evenly, the way she did when something had been sitting long enough to be reported rather than felt, but her hands were not entirely still in her lap. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she braced herself, for the gentle advice, for the carefully phrased observation about limits, for the inevitable question of why she let them do this to her, which was the question everyone who didn't understand the situation eventually arrived at. "How much do you need?" he said instead. She looked at him. "What? To cover the client funds. How much?" "No." The word came out before she'd finished processing the question. "Absolutely not." "Naomi." "No. I am not borrowing money from you." "I didn't say borrow." He set his glass down and turned to face her fully. "I said how much. This is a favor between friends. You have an event that a client is counting on and a gap that isn't your fault. Let me fill the gap. That is not a small favor. It isn't a large one to me. And before you say something about not wanting to owe anyone." He paused, reading her expression with an accuracy that was slightly irritating. "This isn't about owing. It's about you not having to cancel an event you've already given weeks of work to because someone helped themselves to money that was never theirs to take." He held her gaze steadily. "You would do it for me." Without hesitating. She opened her mouth and then closed it, because he was right, and they both knew it, and she hated that he had gotten there so quickly. "You should learn to let people in sometimes," he said, more quietly. "You don't have to hold everything alone." She looked away from him. The tightness that had been sitting in her chest for 3 days shifted, just slightly, and the relief of it was so unexpected that her eyes stung for a moment before she could get ahead of it. She was absolutely not going to cry in front of him. She had made herself that promise on the walkover. She did, a little, despite her best efforts, and he pretended with great care not to notice. "Okay," she said finally, quietly. "Thank you. Don't mention it." He picked his wine glass back up with the ease of a man who considered the matter entirely resolved. "Seriously. Don't. Just go run your event." She laughed once, short and a little unsteady, and then she leaned back against the sofa cushion and let out a breath that had been waiting several days to go somewhere. They sat like that for a while, not saying much, the city quiet beyond the window. At some point she rested her head against his shoulder, and he let her, and neither of them made anything of it. When she got up to leave they held onto each other for a moment at the door, a hug that was longer than it needed to be and said more than either of them had put into words all evening. On his way back through the hallway after she left, the calm Andrew had held in place for her slipped off entirely. He stood in his own apartment in the quiet, jaw tight, thinking about a stepmother who had helped herself to money that didn't belong to her, and about relatives arranged on sofas delivering verdicts, and about Naomi sitting in the middle of all of that for years and calling it, in her own words, keeping the family together. He took out his phone and called Daniel. "We have work to do," he said. "I need her account locked so that no one except her can access it. I don't care how we arrange it or how long it takes. I want it done." Daniel, to his credit, did not ask a single unnecessary question. "Give me until morning," he said. The next afternoon, Monique's card declined at a nightclub. She held it out to the machine again, just in case, and it declined a second time. She stared at it for a long moment, then at the small group of friends watching her, and the only thing she could say was, "What the hell?" Naomi's catering event was held on a Thursday evening, and it went extraordinarily well. The client was a gallery owner hosting a season-opening reception, 200 guests, the kind of crowd that had opinions about food and was not shy about sharing them. Naomi had been building the menu for 6 weeks. She ran the kitchen the way she always did, tight, precise, warm with her team and exacting about the details, the way her mother had taught her to be. By the time the last dessert tray went out and the first genuine compliments started finding their way back through the waitstaff, she already knew it had gone the way she needed it to. 2 new clients approached her before the evening was over. She took their cards, smiled, and allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, the particular satisfaction of work that had turned out exactly as it was supposed to. She texted Andrew on the way home, "It went well." His reply came in under 30 seconds, "I know it did. Come upstairs when you get back." She found him in his kitchen with a bottle of wine already open and 2 glasses waiting, as though he had decided sometime earlier in the day that they were going to celebrate, and the outcome of the event had simply been a formality. "You didn't need to do this," she said, setting her bag down. "I know." He poured her a glass and slid it across the island. "Tell me about it." So she did. She told him about the gallery owner's expression when the first course went out. About the comment she had overheard from a food critic standing near the back. About the 2 new clients and what they were looking for, and the mental math she was already running about capacity. She talked with her hands the way she did when she was genuinely happy about something, animated in a way she usually kept contained, and he leaned against the counter across from her and listened with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered to him, asking questions at the right moments, following the thread of it without rushing her toward a conclusion. She realized at some point, in the middle of describing the dessert course, that she couldn't remember the last time she had come home after a success and had somewhere to put it. Someone to tell it to, who actually wanted to hear. "You did that," he said, when she had finished. "Not the money, not anything else. You made it possible. I moved a number from one place to another," he said simply. "You built the menu. You ran the kitchen. You showed up and did the work. Those are not the same thing." He raised his glass slightly. "Your mother taught you well." She looked at him, and something in his face was open and sincere in the way that she still hadn't entirely gotten used to, even after all these weeks. "She did," she said, a little more quietly. "She really did." The conversation moved the way it sometimes did between them, from the surface into something deeper, without any particular effort or announcement. He asked about her mother, and she told him more than she usually told people. How her mother had been patient in the kitchen in a way that she hadn't always managed elsewhere, how the illness had taken her when Naomi was still far too young for it, how learning to cook in the years after was a way of holding on to what had been good and specific and hers. She spoke about her father too, and the promise she had made him to keep the family together, and the particular weight of carrying something like that for so long. He listened to all of it with the steadiness she had come to rely on more than she'd meant to. Then, when she was done, he told her about his own parents, the accident that had taken them both when he was still finding his footing, the way his uncle had stepped into the shape they left and filled it as completely as a person could, the way grief had eventually become something quieter and more livable without ever becoming small. He told it plainly, without performing it, and she heard the thing underneath it anyway. "Your parents would have been so proud of you," she said, when he had finished. She meant it without qualification, without softening or hedging or the kind of politeness that made words mean less. "Everything you've built. The way you carry yourself. They would have been so proud." He held those words somewhere quiet and careful inside himself for a long moment before he answered. "Thank you," he said, and the sincerity of it was complete. "That means more than you know." They looked at each other in the warm light of the kitchen, and the thing that had been building between them, for weeks, in all the small accumulated moments, arrived quietly at its destination. All Naomi's eyes could do was zero in on his face. His eyes. His lips. Her body was already on the move, but her mind was still torn between both sides, as indecisive as always, on whether or not it was finally okay, to just take whatever it was, that she so damn wanted. "And that's where we'll have to leave it for now. Please don't throw anything at the screen, but we're out of time." I know. Right when things were finally heating up between them. "Forgive me, please. But so, what do you think? Did you enjoy this first half? Because I'm dying to move on to what happens next too. If you want to see part 2, just type part 2 in the comments below. And while you're at it, tell me, what do you think happens next? Will Naomi and Andrew finally seal the deal they've been putting off for so long? How will her stepmother and stepsister react when they realize their financial lifeline just got cut off? I want to hear all your thoughts and theories. But most importantly, a huge, heartfelt thank you to everyone for helping me hit 500 subscribers. I couldn't have gotten here without you amazing people. My next goal is 1,000, so if you love this type of content, please don't forget to like, comment, hit that subscribe button, and turn on those notifications so you won't miss part 2. Thank you so very much for watching, and I'll be right back with the next one.